Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes. Welcome to Everything Cooperative. This is a great Thursday morning. Right quickly, I want to give a shout out to Councilwoman Anita Bonds from D.C., who has created the LEC, the Limited Equity Cooperative Housing Task Force, and we had a hearing yesterday, and that was quite exciting. But today, we're going to talk about the impact of co-ops on the U.S. economy, and we have two people online this morning. We have Margaret Lund and Leiha Edmonds. Good morning, ladies.
Morning. Good morning.
Who want to start off first talking about how you got involved in co-ops? What's been your history with co-ops? Okay, Margaret.
Okay, I'll start. So the longer answer, well, let's see. I've worked directly in the co-op sector for 25 years or more. But my dad was interested and active in co-ops. He was one of early board member of Group Health, which is now Health Partners, which is the largest consumer-governed health their health plan, and they're also own clinics and stuff like that. Anyway, so he was involved with that in various ways. And so I don't know, there's probably something about, it just gets in your blood. So it wasn't like I was instructed to, but I kind of knew that there was this other way of doing things that was, really impactful and above board. And then I was interested in the issues and democracy and self-help and people being able to just do things for themselves, and co-ops fit right in there. So I worked with employee-owned businesses early in my career, and then I started working directly with cooperatives in 1992, and I've been doing it ever since.
Wow. Okay. I envy people like you that your parents got you into co-ops. I didn't learn about co-ops until I was 55 years old. So yeah, you got it early on. And what about you, Leiha? How you say your first name?
Leah. It's just spelled a little differently, but
okay, Leiha. Okay.
Yep, Leiha Edmonds, and I'm a researcher at Urban Institute, which maybe isn't exactly within the cooperative space, but I can tell you a bit about my work and how I got into writing this paper, The ABCs of Cooperative Impact. So Urban Institute's a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization. We recently celebrated our 50-year anniversary. We were created by President Lyndon Johnson's administration. Under the Great Society program, they wanted a research institute that could evaluate the war on poverty. And since those days, we've evolved, we've grown. There are now 12 research centers that focus on everything from healthcare to criminal justice system. And the center I work in is the Metropolitan Housing and Community Center. And my work in that is in community and economic development. So to backtrack a little bit to my connection to cooperatives, well before I worked at Urban Institute, I spent about 5 years as a union organizer working with low-wage workers in healthcare and childcare sectors, predominantly Black and brown women in Chicago, East St. Louis, who were trying to fight for better pay, benefits, access to career ladder. And it was through organizing I was introduced to cooperatives, specifically in the home care sector. Mm-hmm. So worker cooperatives, the Cooperative Home Care Association in New York is obviously huge in the field and presents this different model of how workers can improve themselves, become worker owners, access a different level of wage and benefits, as well as respect and dignity for the work. And I saw firsthand that private, for-profit home care corporations were doing the work often at the expense of client care, as well as workers' fair treatment, fair pay, and access to opportunity. So I became interested in cooperatives through that exposure to home care co-ops. And from there, I went on to really focus in my graduate school time in community and economic development, thinking about the research methodology of how do you measure economic impact that's beneficial for all folks, not just, the existing business class. How do you plan for community development that's inclusive and supportive, especially in communities that have historically been under-resourced? So with that kind of journey, getting to Urban Institute, when the National Cooperative Business Association, NCBA-CLUSA, was interested in getting kind of an outside organization to help them think about metrics for measuring impact, my colleague and lead author on this, Brett Theodos, was in conversation with them, and I was really happy to jump on because of my previous kind of exposure and interest in co-ops, as well as my background in measurement and evaluation.
Leah, it found out you got the bug also. a whole different way.
I did. Yeah, it's a different path, but I have been learning so much from folks like Margaret and others in the field who really have been so generous with their time and knowledge about co-ops beyond like my small knowledge of home care cooperatives, to expand that and think about what housing cooperatives mean, what credit unions are doing, and giving me a much broader exposure in doing this research.
You just described the fifth principle of co-ops as education, as information, knowledge, just transferring of data. And I found that in the co-op world, people do that. And so it's exciting I've taught 12 years in my career, and it's just so exciting to see knowledge being transferred. And there's no sort of, I've got to hold on to this. If I give this away to you, I'll lose my advantage and all of this stuff. But people really do share data, and that makes it very, very nice. That's one of the other things. Well, that was the first thing I liked about this. Maybe the second. So let's talk about the ABCs, the impact of co-ops. So let's start with you, Leah.
Yep.
Can you tell us, the audience, and what was the methodology that you all used? And I heard you say that NCBA wanted to be able to measure impact of co-ops. So how did you go about doing that?
Yes. So what we did, we're not actually measuring that impact. We're giving kind of the tools so that cooperatives themselves can measure their larger community impact. And we know a lot of research and work has already been done on the benefits for members and cooperatives. The paper that I worked on was actually looking into what are the spillover effects that cooperatives provide to the larger community, and how can co-ops kind of get the tools to measure how they build equitable, healthy, sustainable communities, inclusive economies that speak not just within the co-op world, but to policymakers, to a state legislator, so they can better tell the story of cooperatives through data and the measurable effects that go beyond this member received this benefit. It's actually a whole community benefits when there's a cooperative business in a neighborhood or in a county, in a rural area.
Okay. So, Margaret, they're talking about the types of co-ops in this paper. And their definitions are a little bit different from mine. So can you just tell us about the types of co-ops that you know about, or even the ones that are in the paper?
Yeah, so my part of this project, which was a collaboration, it's NCBA and Co-op Development Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson, Urban Institute, and I'm one of the researchers on it as well. So my part of this project was to do case studies and say, okay, how does this abstract idea of access, what does that mean to somebody really in the community? And so it's a big topic because all of us in co-ops, we all, it's like the elephant. Like we know co-ops, but maybe we only know our part of co-ops or the way that co-ops work in our area or in our sector or whatever. And co-ops are really obviously very diverse. So we were trying to say that these 7 things are something that all co-ops really have in common. It's a commonality no matter if you're like a little tiny, worker co-op cafe or you're a huge electric co-op. There are things that we actually all have in common. So it was a big task of trying to, corral all these ideas. So we ended up kind of focusing, in certain sectors. So like, finance one, like credit unions. And then we put producer co-ops in with business co-ops because it's like people with independent businesses, and then they're collaborating together. And housing co-ops are one, and utilities are one, consumer and worker. So, it's always like a little imperfect in how you kind of group people together. But then within those categories, we were looking in my part of it for just examples and stories from people of what, what these things meant. Like, what does that mean that co-ops are about civic engagement, So anyway, that was my part of the project, was kind of collecting those stories within these kind of sector areas, and then the paper has a longer case study of a good example in each case.
Okay, so what I would like to do is, if I could get Leah to talk about the 7 principles that you mentioned, and access is the first one. That's the A one, A for access, and the ABCs. So if Mia could talk about what access is, what it means, maybe even how you measure it, and then Margaret, if you could give us some examples of the different sectors and what does it mean for that particular sector, like credit unions or food co-ops.
Yeah.
So Leah, why don't you talk about access first? What as the first of the 7?
Yeah. So our 7, and they go alphabetical, beginning with access. I would note we created this thinking about both from the data world, a little bit of the outputs and outcomes. So outputs being the quantity of an activity, such as the number of loans a credit union might give, as well as an outcome, which would be that enduring change in attitudes, behavior, economic conditions that come from it. So that credit union gives a loan, and that increases housing stability for someone. That's an opportunity for a new Black-owned business in a community. So thinking about both kind of what are those more mission-driven outcomes as well as specific outputs. And like Margaret mentioned, we know it's a diverse field, and we weren't trying to tell any one kind of type of co-op how to measure it, but give a framework so they could apply what they already know, what data they already have to this. And I'd also, just before I start, saying data defined not just as the numbers, but as Margaret really beautifully illustrates, the more qualitative or narrative research. What are the stories of that? What are interviews that you can do with members in the community that are also, showing the themes of how cooperatives benefit a larger community? So that being said, I can start with access, and then we'll go through to business sustainability and move from there.
Okay, let me get you to stop for a moment, because we have to take our first break. But in talking about access, we got 7 different variables that we're going to talk about. I want to take one of them at a time. So I'm going to want you, when we get back from the break, to talk about access and how you did it. I guess you talked about outputs and outcomes. And then I would like Margaret to tell a story about one of the different types of co-ops and its outputs and outcomes as it relates to access. And then we'll go to the next and the next. So that's what I have in mind. And we'll be right back. Please, everybody out there, don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. Talk about access.
Washington, D.C.'s News Talk, 1450 AM WOS and 95.9 FM.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes, and the program is Everything Co-op. And we are talking about a book or white paper, The ABCs of Co-op Impact, with Margaret Lund and Leiha Edmonds. So what we said before the break was we're going to talk about the first variable that was measuring impact, and that's access. And Leiha is going to talk about what access is, what's the kind of outputs and outcomes of access, and then Margaret's going to follow back with an example or a story. Okay, Leiha, you're up.
All right. So a cooperative can increase access to affordable, quality products, services, suppliers, and markets, lowering costs and serving markets and communities historically seen as, and I'll use quotes, higher risk or underserved. So what that might look like when we talked about kind of outputs and outcomes in the credit union space, for example, that could be something like expanded account and product availability, more flexible underwriting standards. You could measure, the fact that there are lower rates and fees at credit unions. There's personalized customer service, decreased use of high-cost alternative financial services such as check cashing. So were it not for that credit union there, would people be turning to less desirable options? And then in kind of the outcome space, also improved financial health for members in the community that credit union serves. So that's how we started thinking through all of these. And Margaret has really great case studies that that explore this much more deeply as well, how that's being applied.
Okay, Margaret, tell us some of these case studies on access.
Yeah, so access is a core one, and the greatest story, which is not as well known as it should be, in America, is the story of the rural electric co-ops. I mean, it just was an enormous change. I mean, it's hard to imagine from sitting from our, iPhone linked world or whatever, that depending how old you are, like some of our grandpa grew up without electricity. And when you think of what that means, it's not just sort of the convenience, like I can't watch TV. It was like, women were boiling laundry outside on fires, to wash clothes, and people were wanting with lanterns, to the barn to go take care of the cows or whatever. I mean, it was a huge deal, and it's really hard to believe that, up until the 30s, up until the rural electrification that was part of the New Deal, that enormous section of rural America didn't have electric power. And the thing is, like we all know, like electricity existed, right? Like people in, cities had electricity in their homes for years and years and years, before the 30s. So it wasn't a technology problem. It was a problem basically of access. Like you couldn't make enough money. I mean, everybody, you look at like rural areas, how far is it from one customer to another? There's a lot of miles there. Somebody has to lay some, some groundwork, for those miles, and an investor-owned utility is like, not so much. I would rather serve an apartment building where, I don't have to do that. I can just like wire one building and I can make all this money, whereas in a rural area you don't. So that's one of the huge, just really, really starting examples of working cooperatively, that communities, and it wasn't, the government helped. Of course, obviously they did. There were government loans because they're utilities. You're building big things, people can't afford to just, in the middle of the Depression to finance, a transmission, whatever, co-op or something. But the whole structure really was based on people, like they had to sign up. It was a Depression, and they had to put some money on the table if they wanted it, and people had to go around their communities and organize and get enough neighbors and say, we all want this. And so it was really, and they're still today, they're governed by community members. Those are utilities that aren't, governed by investors. They're governed by people in the community. So that's one of the biggest, because it makes an enormous difference. If, you look at the data about what difference electrification makes, it's not just convenience. Literacy rates shot up in rural areas because guess what? Like people can do their homework at night, not by kerosene lamp. It's, in businesses, people can start in businesses, and if somebody has a electric, washing machine that farm, usually wife, almost always wife, just saved hours and hours and hours of time. And what could she do at that time? Well, maybe she starts a little business and raises some chickens and does something else, So it was a huge difference, and it really had to do, it was all about access. It wasn't about technology because, of course, it existed. So I think that's really the best. And then, credit unions, particularly.
Before you move on,
yeah,
you were kind of smiling, I heard in your voice while you were talking about this, but I grew up in Bluefield, West Virginia.
Yeah.
And there, in our home, we had electricity and water, but we had an outhouse. We did not have, and this is, I think it came in the house in the mid-'60s, maybe, early 60s. But we were considered wealthy. My grandmother was, because we had a house with electricity and water in it.
Right.
And that was extremely amazing. And looking back, I would think we grew up relatively poor, at least through my generation. But this just having electricity. And Martin Lowry, who's the vice president of the National Rural Electric, I guess it's the foundation or organization, he was talking about how these big burly guys will go to communities now outside of the U.S. that don't have electricity, and they'll put up the lines. They will go, and this is the other thing that co-ops do, help other co-ops form and so forth. So they'll go to Guatemala, El Salvador, or some other country, Africa, Latin America, and they put up these lines, and they said when the lights come on, these guys come back all teary-eyed, having seen the joy in people's faces and experience that they can do their homework at night.
Mm-hmm.
And so access is a great example. Thank you.
Right, and it's so cooperative because it's really about self-help. So it's not like they went and gave them a whole bunch of money, right? Like,
right.
Here, we're so great, we're rich, we're going to give this to you. They're like, we gave you, the opportunity. We give you a tool that you can use, and you can take your ingenuity and your energy and your smarts and, your commitment, and you can make something of that because now you have, this tool. And so that's, really what co-ops are about. They're not about here's the thing. They're about self-help. There's
self-help.
Here's the tool.
Self-help. Self-responsibility.
Do something great because I know you can,
Yes.
So Access is a huge part. And then, we don't have a ton of time, but of course credit unions are a huge part of that too, particularly community development credit unions are a huge part of Access. I mean, if you look at the data, the average account size of credit unions is really small compared to banks. And you might why are they all so small? But it's because a lot of people, that's what their life is. The credit union's going where people are at and helping them and, giving them their first accounts or their only accounts. I mean, the case study I did was actually the DC credit union in your town. And DC, their rate of people being unbanked is 20% above, the rest of the country. So it's hugely important that community development credit unions like DC Credit Union are around so they can be there and give people affordable access to kind of basic financial services without ripping them off, in their interest.
So you say unbanked, meaning that 20% more people don't have a bank account or a checking account in D.C. than the rest of the nation.
Yeah.
And that means that they will go somewhere to a predatory lender or get their check cash and pay 3% or something just to get their check cash and all of these different ripoffs. I call them ripoffs.
Yeah.
Okay. Where if they join a credit union, not only can they get their checks cash at no charge, but they can get loans, and loans might be to buy a computer, buy a refrigerator, buy whatever. And because a group of people put their money together so that they can borrow when they need it, buy a car, and then eventually buy a house. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's access. So we want to go next to business sustainability and stability. So that's the B.
So
Leiha.
Business sustainability, a cooperative business structure can increase firm survival and profitability through higher and less volatile revenues, lower costs, and a focus on long-term outcomes, including scaling the cooperative to compete with even multinational corporations. So when we thought about the metrics, how you could measure something like this in the space of maybe a marketing or a processing or a purchasing co-op, that could mean things like measuring the improved marketing and distribution that co-op provides, increased productivity and production, lower costs for suppliers and services, increased market share for that company, improved profitability, decreased revenue volatility, and increased firm survival. So that's the way we were thinking about measuring. And again, Margaret can really bring that to life with how co-ops are sustaining businesses over long periods of time and having really tremendous impact on their communities.
Okay, Margaret, that was your cue.
Yeah. So the business sustainability is really one of the major outcomes of the whole group of co-ops, of farmer co-ops and also purchasing co-ops, small business purchasing co-ops, because that's really what they're trying to do is can we all work together, and use our buying power or selling power to help make each of our individual businesses work better. And one of the best examples, I think, of this whole thing is Organic Valley, the organic milk company. So they're a familiar name now because they're enormously successful, but, they weren't always huge. When they started, nobody was doing organic dairy. Organic dairy, you really would just sell it at the farm stand. I mean, there wasn't really any system. There wasn't any structure. And one of the problems, obviously, in dairy, issues in dairy, I mean, the price, it's a commodity, and the price fluctuates enormously, and that's really difficult for farmers. I mean, just in general, like the price fluctuation. And then organic, people are like, well, what is organic, and what do we pay for organic? And so one of the huge innovations, the things that they did is they committed when they started that co-op, they were like, we're about price stability and sustainability. So they wanted to say, we want to make the world basically a different place. We want to be organic farmers, but we want to have a more, we don't want to deal on this roller coaster of price situations all the time. So they just got together, in their co-op, and they're like, okay, we're the co-op that's selling organic milk. It's a particular thing in this market. And, they figured out, how much does it cost?
Margaret.
Does it literally cost? Yep.
I'm sorry, we got to stop, and we're going to come back and talk about whether you got milk or not. We'll be right back.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Welcome back, everybody. You know, we're talking about co-ops and the ABCs of co-op impact, and there are several different variables. We've talked about access, and that is the members or the community or the clients or the customers will have access to products that they would not normally have. And we talked about rural electric, and we talked about credit unions. And now we're talking about business sustainability. And I just get that sustainability and stability is how long do they last? How long do they go? So co-ops last a lot longer. Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nimhard said that for a normal capital business, a small business will start, and after 5 years, only 10% of them are still around. But in the co-op world, there's 90% still around after 5 years. So if that's sustainability and stability, that is what we're talking about. And Margaret was talking about Organic Valley before we took break.
Right. So that's exactly right, though. Yeah, because co-ops are kind of in it for the long term. You know, it's not just the quarterly. What have you done for me lately? It's like, what are you going to do for me and my grandchildren? Okay. Exactly. That's exactly right. So Organic Valley, when they were kind of building this new industry at the time, a new industry of organic dairy, they was like, well, we don't, these price fluctuations in dairy are like, they're really hard on the farmer, and particularly the small farmer, and their members were all small farmers. Their average herd is still really like under 100 cows. It used to be 40, it's like maybe 70. But anyway, they're small farmers, right? And so they said, okay, we're just going to sell our milk. We're going to figure out what it costs for a family farm to raise organic, and then that's what we're going to sell. And that's just it. We're going to sell our milk at a price that's sustainable. And even if the market price is above that or below that, our farmers know that if we have this sort of middle ground, like we're going to always give them, they're going to get stability, and they're going to get protected from the volatility of the market. So it might at some point, like sometimes Organic Valley pays their members more than market, sometimes they pay them less, but over the long run, it's a good deal. And everybody understands over the long run, they get a net benefit, and they also get the tremendous benefit of this, much, much more stable price. So those are the kinds of things that co-ops do when they get together, that small businesses, farmers, either farmers or, just regular small businesses and purchasing co-ops get together. They have an effect on their market that helps them run their business better and helps them, be a better source of income for their family, a more stable source of income.
That's what is so exciting about co-ops. And I like the first principle, they're open to anybody. It doesn't make any difference about your race or religion or your politics or where you're from. It's open. Co-ops are open, and I like that. I think that might have been the first reason. Who knows? But I like co-ops. There's a lot of reasons. Okay, so let's go to the third, community commitment. Leah. Yeah.
A community-focused cooperative is committed to being a good neighbor through education, financial support, facility use, and environmentally sound business practices. So, like we've been saying with these past ones, to measure the broader community effects that a cooperative has, say you're a housing co-op and you have community meeting space in your building, being able to count the number of times that you have the shared use of a facility. You allow people in the community to hold their meetings there, for example. So being able to create metrics that allow a cooperative to measure facility use and business practice that reflect that bigger business commitment would be a way to measure it. I'm aware of time, so I'm not going to read through all of my different metrics for this, and I want to give a little bit for Margaret to share an example, and we can keep going through these ABCs.
Yeah, so I'll talk for hours on both these things.
I knew we could do this for hours because it's exciting. Yes.
I know. Talk fast. Okay. So I'm just going to tell you one of my favorites. This is a little bit of an obscure example because lots and lots of co-ops do this. They just have community space. They do education. I mean, this is really a huge co-op thing. So there's, scratch a co-op and you can find, something they've done for their community. But one of the ones I thought was really interesting that I came across in these case studies, it's another electric co-op. So it's Bark Electric, and it's rural. It's not West Virginia, Western Virginia. So, some co-ops, their members wanted more, solar, and so the co-op's like, okay, well, we have the capacity, right? We have the knowledge and the, financial resources. We're going to build a solar array, and, so people can, access, they can sign up and say, okay, we're going to buy a little piece of this solar power or whatever. So that's great. But one of the real innovative things they did was they looked, to the school districts, and they said to the school districts, you can save a lot of money if you signed up for the solar thing. And in fact, rather than just signing them up as a customer, they said, because you're the schools, right? You've got a bunch of stuff. You really should just have your own solar array. And so we're gonna build it for you and finance it for you and run it for you. So make it really easy. And then you, the school district, can have your own solar array and have your own access to solar power. And so it's the Bath County School District that signed on for this. And so they did that. They agreed to that. And then this county, it's small school district, but now 50% of their power comes from solar. And they have one of their schools is the only net zero school building in the entire state of Virginia. So they're in like rural area, and they're leading in this super cool area of, we're net zero, we have no emissions. And so the students, and they work it into their education because, they have it right there. They're like, here's what our literal school is doing to, fight climate change and make the world a better place. But what was, so interesting about it is like, they didn't just say, we're going to sell it to you. They said, we're going to build it for you. We're going to let you, the school system, run your own one. And so what that means is that these systems, as I'm told, I'm not an expert, but, there's sort of a 20-year capital cost. Like, they're all based on paying back the cost of it over 20 years, but they really last more like 35 years. And so for the school district, it means so for 20 years, they get a good deal. And then the last 15 years, they get an amazing deal because they would have paid off basically the cost of their whole solar array, but they still have the use of it, or good use of it for approximately 15 years. So the real effect of it is not just, the immediately, like, we gave you a better deal on energy and now your kids are super, engaged in what's going on, but they, 20 years from now, they give them 15 years of almost, not quite free because they have to maintain it and stuff, but almost free energy. And so it's like giving, this enormous tax increase, it's like a huge contribution to the school system without raising any taxes or anything. And it's all because they have this orientation about the community, about not just can we sell things to people, but can we help the community help themselves? And in the case of the school district, they're sort of a big enough customer that it made sense that they should just have their own array. So the rural electric's like, here, we're going to help you. So it's just such a huge deal. People are always, and particularly, are struggling to pay for, schools on the backs of property taxes or other taxes. And, this rural electric code just comes in and makes this enormous contribution, which didn't involve taxes, which just involved them being smart and generous with their time and their expertise and their resources.
So they took their money, their knowledge, their time, and they created a solar panel farm
for the schools,
for the school systems, and which gives them almost free electricity, which lowers the cost of education. And the kids learn about this. They go out, and I think they took tours, and they learn all about it, and they have a class about this. So they get to learn about this in real time, real life. It just helps the community. And that's the seventh principle. That's why it's so much in co-ops. If they're living the principles, the seventh principle is concern for community.
Right.
And if you look at the ethical values, it is honesty, integrity. I like the ethical values of honesty, integrity, concern, social responsibility, and concern for one another. So if you're living that concern for one another and you're social responsible and you're concerned for the community, you do things like this. And you didn't even talk about they brought broadband into.
Yeah, the broadband too. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and all these things. I mean, education, it all helps the community because they can retain workers, they can retain, people can start businesses, they can run their businesses better. I mean, all of those things that help small communities, hang on to their folks, which is important to their tax base and to their, longevity.
Leah, I'm laughing. If you give up your time, Margaret and I are going to take it.
Yeah, we are. Well, I'll be quiet.
No, don't be quiet. We can talk about this a lot longer, but we're going to go to the D, number 4. Democratic governance and membership empowerment. Leah, talk about that for us, please.
Yeah, we define that as in a well-functioning cooperative, membership actively participates and shapes the mission and decisions of the organization, which translates into broader civic and political involvement. So for cooperatives to better tell the story of what they do through data, one thing that a co-op could start collecting data on and track over time is how many of its members are engaged in broader civic issues. So how many run for office? How many are on the PTA? Co-op members live in our communities, and co-ops have the opportunity to track that and start collecting data on it to really show the story of their community and civic involvement as well.
I think one of my first shows was a guy named Papa Sin from Senegal. Mm-hmm. And he talked about how the members there, they started out with housing, and then they got a school, and then they had then transportation, then a school co-op. They kept growing. And he talked about how people then that were members of these co-ops, they went out and became on the Board of Education. They ran for the board, then they ran for city council, and just very much more engaged in civic duty. So right 6 years ago, October, right away we had that conversation about member engagement. So example.
Yeah, that's true, and that's actually a study that really needs to happen, because I think that anecdotally that happens all over, that people that grow up, for example, in housing co-ops, like they just have this idea that they can affect the world or something, and that you carry that idea forward, and it's very powerful. So this is one of my favorite ones, because it really does differentiate co-ops from other kinds, both regular companies, but also from nonprofits, which are nice but not democratic. So what's the difference? What difference does it make? And it makes a lot of difference for people sometimes, and like manufactured home communities, people own they own their own homes, but they collectively own the land, and they get to set their own rules. I mean, it just makes a huge difference. So people are like, well, what are we going to fix first, and what are the priorities? And people can talk about it, and they don't have somebody else telling them that. What I also think of, and now, we feel like, food co-ops and natural food is ubiquitous, and there's Whole Foods all over the place and everything like that, but that didn't always used to be the case. The consumer food co-ops in the U.S., they really invented the natural foods movement. So the market was like, oh, you don't, we're going to give you canned food. You don't want all that weird stuff. And people were like, yes, we do. And so we're going to create our own, systems to deliver and be able to buy the stuff that we want. So sometimes it's as simple as that. It was like, this is what a bunch of us would like the world to look like, and so we're going to make that happen. And in the case of natural foods, obviously, a bunch of the rest of the market were like, yeah, that's a pretty good idea. That's good stuff. We want that too. But it really was a bunch of people just, not letting, a company or a corporation say, this is what you should buy, this is what you should eat, this is what you should want. And they're like, no, we want something different. Mm-hmm. Here's what we actually want. And then it, turned out that a bunch of other people wanted that same thing, that lots of people are interested in organic food and natural food because, for various reasons, their own reasons, they just want it. That's what they want to buy. So now that's an area where, sort of investor-owned companies pay catch up to the co-ops, because the co-ops knew what people wanted, and they know what people want because of members, because of democracy. That's the reason. Not because their market research is better. It's because they have democracy, and they just ask people. They have avenues and structures to ask people what they need and want, and what they think their institutions should look like.
So this is the one member, one vote. That's the second principle, democratic control. And most people will talk about co-ops being the small d, and then our U.S. political system is the big D. I think it's the opposite. I think the co-ops is the big D for democracy, because you have much more engagement. In the U.S. right now, I think it was 42% in the last election, people that could vote came out and vote. Some smaller number. I don't know if that's the exact number. And so you just don't have that kind of engagement. And I believe that as more and more people get involved in co-ops, you will get more and more engagement. And that's number 4. So we got to keep moving it here.
We do.
Number 5, equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Yeah. So for this, we said to be an effective contributor to its community, cooperative membership reflects the community in racial composition, gender, age, disability, and in addition, historically excluded communities are given leadership opportunities within the co-op. So in measuring something like this, we suggest that cooperatives can begin by collecting data on their membership demographics.
And I want you to stop right there, Leah. We're going to take our final break, and that will only give us about 12 or 13 minutes to get over these final 3. But I like this one. We'll come back with the principle 1 of this diversity. We'll be right back.
Washington, D.C.'s News Talk, 1450 AM WOL and 95.9 FM.
Information is power, and that's why the WOL is a great partner for us, because we're giving you information a lot today about co-ops and the impact that co-ops have on our economy. And we're talking about now people that are normally left out, Black and brown people, Native Americans, and so forth, people that are normally left out, and including women. So, Leah, can you finish talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion?
Yeah. So saying that cooperatives can think of this area in a data-driven way. They can collect data on their membership demographics, race, age, disability, income, and then they can compare that for who makes up the cooperative membership. How does that compare to non-member staff, for example, at a consumer cooperative? And also, how does that match up against the geographic area they serve or the neighborhood they're located? Cooperatives can identify mismatches in representation between the local community and the co-op membership. And with that, start making plans to change that and really advance, especially Black and brown worker leadership, for example, within their co-op to better align with the community they serve. So that's how we were thinking from a more data and metrics side of putting this framework into use.
Well, I was telling you why I really like co-ops. This is one of the reasons that if people are really using the principles, and it doesn't matter about gender or race or age, it just doesn't matter. It's just who can do the job. Then that I like co-ops. Example, Margaret.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you have. You could do a whole show. You could do multiple shows on this because it's such an important topic. And I'm sure you have done whole shows on the Federation of Southern Co-ops because that's obviously our shining example in the southern part of the United States of a whole bunch of co-ops that are started and formed and serve African Americans.
Ralph Page and Cornelius Blanding have been on, and
sure
a couple of people in their organization. I mean, it's a huge organization, yes, and they do great
but,
work.
Another example, because Leah mentioned the home care co-ops. I mean, the Cooperative Home Care Associates in the Bronx, I mean, they're the biggest worker co-op in the country. They have over 2,000 workers, and in, that industry, I mean, it's a low-wage job, and in New York, those are almost all, a lot of them are immigrant women, Hispanic and African American women. There are almost no white people. So it's a business, where you could say, well, it could be a regular business and somebody would own it, but instead of that, they all own it. Like all those workers own that huge successful business. And that's really important example so it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be high wage workers. I mean, if it's a business, people can own it, right? Mm-hmm. And those can be the people that work there that own it, and that's the case in CHCA.
So the executive director, and I cannot remember his name, have been on and talking about some of the challenges that they have and how they work through those challenges.
Right.
And we've had Ujama, which is a artist co-op of women, mainly women of color that create different art in Pittsburgh. They've been on. So yeah, it's exciting stuff. Oh, I love it. Okay, now what's F?
So F is financial security and advancement for workers. And cooperatives can work best for their members, employees, and the community when they provide living wage jobs with benefits, increase opportunity for wealth building, career advancement, training, and leadership development with lower turnover and higher job satisfaction. So in our framework for metrics, we propose that co-ops could actually survey their members and assess job satisfaction, perhaps track over time the turnover rate, and really create kind of that data story of what the opportunities are for wealth building in a community that comes from having it be a cooperative business rather than a non-cooperative business. There are more, but again, for time, I'll stop there for some of the metrics side.
Wow. We got to have you guys back on, maybe 7 different shows on each one of these. Okay. Financial security and advancement.
So the biggest example, obviously, which is worthy of its own show, is the worker co-op sector, because that's the sector of the co-ops where they say people that work in the co-op, like not only do you work for us, but you can be one of the owners. And I've actually written a manual on multi-stakeholder co-ops, which are co-ops which have more than one member category. So it might be consumers and workers both share ownership. And I feel like that's a really important way, an underutilized way in the U.S., but utilized more in other countries, that co-ops could create a separate category and bring their workers into being one category of members along with their other members. But I just want to give a shout out because we haven't really talked about housing co-ops. And even though it's not about workers, there's a bunch of data that housing stability is a huge the stability of someone's housing has a big effect on like kids going to school and finishing school, and also people keeping jobs. Like the more stable housing is for people, like the better their financial security is in a lot of different ways. And you talked at the beginning of the show about limited equity housing co-ops. I mean, limited equity housing co-ops and other housing co-ops that are manufactured home communities, or the work that the folks that you have do in New York City, the HUD co-ops, and all of those limited equity co-ops that provide stable, affordable housing. There's a huge contribution they make to each one of those households to the financial security of those individual households, because they know they have housing. Their rent's not going to get jacked up next week. They're not going to get kicked out for some stupid reason. There's a democratic process that governs all the house rules, and it just makes a huge difference for people. So, it's the workplace is the obvious place to look at that, but it's not the only place that co-ops impact financial security for households.
And when you look at gentrification that's really happening here in D.C., that gap gets to be bigger and so forth. But John Torres from NCBA spoke yesterday at this hearing that Councilwoman Anita Bonds had, and he even brought it down. I was sitting next to him as he talked. We were on the same panel, and he talked about the physical health. I mean, you mentioned the other things he talked about, but I never thought about as much the physical health, how much healthier people can be when they have stable housing. It's amazing. Amazing. Okay, now we're going to go to growth.
Great. So cooperatives can be local and regional anchors promoting economic growth through stable jobs, high industry standards, consistent services, and economic multiplier effects through increased community investment, local hiring, and procurement. So again, perhaps looking at food and grocery co-ops, you could track data that says how much of our food is sourced locally, how many of our employees come right from that neighborhood, and how much of our profit sharing is invested back into the community. So being able to collect data and track that over time, you can then make that kind of really holistic story of how a cooperative is expanding like broader community growth across time.
Examples.
Yeah, so this is another way. I mean, you mentioned the fact that co-ops stick around longer. Co-ops kind of have a different horizon. They're kind of the slow and steady wins the race, sort of theory of economic development. And so, you don't have these like enormous ups and downs, but you have like very good, consistent companies. And one of my favorites of many is this worker co-op in Petaluma, California, called Alvarado Street Bakery. And so, like a lot of the bakeries that started, they were a whole grain bakery, and started, when the food co-op started. So they're when Natural Foods was picking up. So there are a lot of bakeries like them, but they're really different. And one of the things that was different about them is they really thought early on that a couple of visionary leaders that they're like, okay, we're baking bread, and there's only so much you can charge for a loaf of bread. And they're in Petaluma, California, which is a very beautiful but very expensive place to live. And so they really thought about, like, how can you use the co-op model? Like, what can we do to make so that we can be a business where we can pay people enough that it's affordable to live in this community, because that's a problem with a lot of communities that are gentrifying, or that the people that do the services in those communities they can't afford to live there or anywhere near there, and so that becomes a huge problem. So what Alvarado Street did is they looked very selectively at mechanization for their bread, and at how they use technology, and the technology that they chose to use, it either had to add to safety for workers, or it had to in a massive way add to kind of because it's a worker-owned co-op, like if the co-op made more money, then everybody would make more money. So it wasn't a win-lose, like we brought this machine and you lost your job. It was like it had to be that everybody would benefit broadly in the co-op if they, adopted some, new mechanized way of doing production. And so they didn't run away from that. They just were very selective. And over the years, what they've been able to do is build a business, very successful business. They have, they ship all over the country, and they pay everybody enough. They're bakers, but they're all paid enough to live, a nice life in Petaluma, California, which is a nice but extremely expensive place to live. So, that's a huge part of kind of growth for that. So, they're not like the biggest selling thing ever, but, they're really they're making that growth inclusive. Like, people talk a lot about kind of like inclusive prosperity, and that's really what they did. They're like, okay, this is a growing business, this is a growing part of the country, but like, how do we make that so that works for everybody who, even if they're it doesn't matter what they're doing, what their job is. Like, how can we, so again, and it's not like charity. It's not like they're giving people money. They're giving them an opportunity to own a business and control a business, and then they run that business in such a way, that they can generate money, that enough funds and share it around in a way so that everybody can, have a decent place to live in the place, where they work. So it's just it's a series of a different set of decisions that they make that ultimately have different outcomes.
Longer-term outcomes, a longer-term view when they're looking at investment, and everybody included. We only have a little less than a minute to go, so I really thank you. Would love to have you guys back. We could spend like a whole show on each of these 7 pieces, and I love it. What would you like to leave people with? Which one of you? What thought?
Well, I would on a closing thought, for cooperatives that are interested in collecting more data, because some already are, but others, this is an area for growth, asking co-ops to, really think about what data they already have and what they want to collect to better tell the story of their work. And with that, put it into action. Think about how you can collect data better, how you can analyze it, and the audience you want to speak to when you're telling, the story of your cooperative. So how do you use data to show the measurable effects the cooperative has on the lives of its members, but also the larger community?
Thank you.
I think these start that. Yep,
thank you much. Thank you guys very much. Everybody out there, we'll see you next Thursday. Please live cooperatively.
Washington, D.C.'s News Talk, 1450 AM WOL and 95.9 FM.